Chicago, 1914. A daring young cameraman went up in a dirigible, higher than any of Chicago's impressive skyscrapers, to look out over the booming city. It was a busy era, when anything was possible. Rags to riches stories still circulated. Optimism still gave hope to every country lad who went to the big city to seek his fortune. It was here in Chicago that George K Spoor, a boy from Highland Park, sought his fortune after the turn of the century. It was through his vision that the movie industry grew up in Chicago. It was his Essanay Studios that turned out thousands of films from 1907 until their closing in 1917. Along with Paris and New York, Chicago was one of the world's great movie capitals. At one time, George Spoor recalled that 14 Essanay film crews were working in Chicago at once. The old movies were treated as products, not valued. Films for a week to be replaced by other films the following week. New releases for the movie parlors of the world. The early films were made of nitrate, highly combustible, dangerous to keep in storage. And so, when the studios closed down, most of the films were burned. The memories of those who worked in the old studios served to reclaim the era. Shorty Richardson, cameraman. He filmed the old westerns by the drainage canal. Les Cobleigh, once an Essanay property man. Dr. Preston Bradley, a close friend of George K Spoor. Mrs. Marvin Spoor, keeper of the family records. Hazel Buddemeyer, former Essanay film editor. It was through Mrs. Buddemeyer that fragments of the films found in basements, garages, and attics were identified. Actors and locations named. The glory of the past, when Chicago was Hollywood. Charlie Chaplin arrived in Chicago in the winter of 1915 with a contract in his baggy pants for the astronomical figure of $1,250 a week, plus bonuses. The weather gave Charlie chilblains, and he found the people a pain in the neck. It was hardly that Charlie had grown too big for his britches. They were ample, part of the typical clown's costume. It was just that Charlie, like it or not, didn't get along with others in the studio. Yet none of his squabbles behind the scenes got in the way of his artistry. Chaplin was the biggest box office draw Essanay had ever known.
He was far different in his daily life than he was when he was at his peak as an actor. He was somewhat on the penurious side.
George bought him his first overcoat. It was cold here when he arrived, and he complained about the weather, so George bought a long overcoat for Charles.
Personally, nobody really liked him. He was such a funny, nothing pleased him, he didn't like Chicago.
No, Chaplin didn't like Chicago because it was too cold. He thought that he'd never get used to the climate here. But the money climate was very beneficial.
Chaplin made only one film in Chicago for Essanay, called His New Job. After protestations about the weather, he escaped to Essanay's West Coast operation under the genial supervision of Bronco Billy Anderson. A year later, George Spoor was disheartened when Chaplin went to Mutual Films to play for higher stakes. Spoor went to France for Chaplin's replacement, one of the finest of all film comedians, Max Linder, and he paid him $5,000 a week. Was it only money that dragged Max Linder away from a more balmy Paris to enter the Chicago cold in the movie studios of Essanay? $5,000 a week in 1917 was nothing to be sneezed at. Before he left Europe, Linder made 360 comedies for Pathé. There he experimented with various kinds of screen characters, a bellboy and a nearsighted old man, blood brother to Mr. Magoo. But it was as Max, dapper man about town, that he made his biggest successes. In a weak moment, Chaplin paid Linder a compliment, called him his teacher. He even modeled some of his routines after Linder's. Linder, like Chaplin, proved to be a rather temperamental character.
He arrived with so many suitcases and hat boxes that they had to have an extra room for him at the hotel. Dozens of hats, dozens of shoes. In fact, he evidently was quite a clothes horse. Very temperamental.
He was the one that was supposed to succeed Chaplin. But as a moneymaker, he never did succeed him.
He wasn't very congenial to people that talked to him, to work with him. You were supposed to know exactly what he wanted. Nobody knew. His pictures were very difficult to cut. In fact, he used to cut some of them himself.
Max wants a divorce. In this film, Linder has just wed a beautiful woman. But he discovers that he will inherit $3 million from a rich uncle if he remains a bachelor. About town do in a dilemma like this? He gives up the beautiful lady, of course, with a bribe or two. From there on, it was touch and go for Max. Max Wants a Divorce is one of the rarest of the Linder films. Only 3 were made at Essanay, and they were all made in Chicago. After a long search, we found this footage in a garage. It had been through heat damage and flood. It was difficult to reclaim. What Americans saw when Linder came on the scene was a brand of comedy they were not used to. They had been attuned to the violence and grotesquerie of rural slapstick. Max brought a wry, continental humor to his films. Max Linder was no second Chaplin. He was first and always Max, unique, a polished film comedian, but a box office bomb in the United States. More trouble. Essanay was one of the members of the Worldwide Patents Trust. In 1917, the Supreme Court decided against the Patents Organization in an antitrust suit, and independent film companies took over. Doomsday for Chicago filmmaking was inevitable. Studios began gambling with the star system. Little-known actors who could barely walk across the street were suddenly whisked away by the independents. Little loyalty was shown. And the stars, Francis X. Bushman, Beverly Bain, Gloria Swanson, and Wallace Beery left for more lucrative offers on the West Coast. Essanay closed down in 1917. It was sad as the studio gave its employees notice.
It was a shock to everybody. All the stage hands had to see it close because there was always a lot of work out here.
George wasn't a good businessman, like a great many other creative people. He was easily swayed in business matters, and he'd overreach. He'd overextend himself in his enterprise. And of course, when the S&A failure came along, George never was the same after that. It did something to him.
He was down. He didn't talk to anybody. And he more or less turned it over to his brother, Bob. He'd done most all the work, and then we didn't see much of Mr. Spoor anymore.
Spoor was not a man to give up, to wither on the vine. He had other commitments to motion pictures, and he went to work. Years later, in 1948, the Motion Picture Academy of Arts and Sciences gave him their highest award for his contributions.
He pioneered in many, many things that Hollywood adopted, but most of it started at home. For instance, some of the first animations made in America were made in Spoor's studio.
This doll had many faces for articulated movement. It was model animation, much like George Pell did 35 years later. Howard Moss was the magician, the animator who could make his dolls come to life. As early as anyone can date it, this film, Cracked Ice, was released in 1916. Hazel Buddemeyer knew Howard Moss and admired his work. When the studio closed down, she saved this film. The Moss dolls were so skillfully animated that his work compares quite favorably with model animation being done today in Europe and the United States. Again, we see the rural wit that prevailed in Chicago, the innocent bumpkin on skates. Animation was one of many experiments encouraged at the Essanay Studios. Spoor himself, after the studio shut down, spent millions of his personal fortune trying to develop the first widescreen film. He worked closely with the inventor John Berggren, and by 1927 had filmed The Flag Maker in a West Coast studio. Spoor and Berggren called their new process natural vision. The film, when projected, produced a picture 42 feet wide and 23 feet high, first of the giant screens. The Chicago film pioneer, whether anybody knew it then, had scored another success, but decades too early. Sound had come to the films. It was the big novelty. Natural vision was virtually talked out of sight.
Well, he was one of the first millionaires. I believe there were 4 in Chicago at that time. And he practically spent all of his money on this venture. After working so many years on this wide film, he was never the least bit resentful. And he told Dr. Bradley one time that they never could take away his dreams.
That wise American philosopher, Ralph Waldo Emerson, one time observed in one of his essays, "Every great institution is the lengthened shadow of a great personality." And I know of no institution in any area of life of which that is more true than it is of George Spoor and the moving picture industry. Experimenting with the widescreen, new ideas in sound, all this was pioneering. And everything that has happened to this great industry, you can go back and put your finger on a dream that George Spoor had for it. The obligation which the industry has to this pioneering mind is an obligation that can never be adequately repaid.
The history of the movies, like any other history, is composed of fragments saved from disasters. So much of what the old directors, actors, and technicians did has been discarded, burned, lost. But what exists shows imagination, the will to experiment, and, human of all human emotions, the will to create something worthy, something magic. Movies grew out of that magic. And for a while, Chicago was part of it.
And motion picture then was nothing, well, we thought was nothing going to be nothing. But look what it is today. Nobody realizes what wonderful experience it was to go through the motion picture business and see it grow the way we did, meet all these actors. Some of them were stars, some of them weren't. It was friendship. It was like a big family. And it really was a pleasure to go to work every morning and meet the people that you learn to love, friendship. And to me, friendship is an awful big thing.
Those of us who pioneered in the development and the creation of the motion picture industry have never lost the fascination of it, and for that reason we are still active. The many changes that have come about, from the crude equipment to the highly developed scientific equipment that's used today, still thrills us and holds us, and probably will hold us the rest of our lives.
From time to time, Hollywood sends its crews to Chicago. It's been said that movie productions may again return to the city. New films to feed the world. To the stout of heart, the vigorous, the talented, that same old opportunity to make films exists. The challenge is the same as it was when Chicago was Hollywood.